Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fierce legal battle happening in India over new university equity rules. And this isn't just about some dry regulations, it's a fight over the very definition of fairness and justice on campus.
So, to really get why these new campus rules have caused such an uproar, we have to understand the deep-seated issues they were actually designed to solve. This isn't just some abstract policy debate. For many, this is literally a matter of life and death.
For years, the system that was in place to protect students, well, it was seen as largely symbolic, and it just wasn't working. That failure had absolutely tragic consequences, which sparked immense pressure from activists and the courts for a complete overhaul. Something had to give.
And look, this didn't just happen overnight, not at all. This timeline really shows a crisis that's been building for over a decade. The 2012 rules were just suggestions. They were advisory, and they proved to be completely insufficient. It was heartbreaking events like the deaths of Rohit Vemula and Dr. Payal Tadvi that galvanized a movement that took its fight for real accountability all the way to the Supreme Court.
And this number right here, it just shows you the sheer scale of the problem. According to the UGC's own data, reported incidents of caste discrimination on campus more than doubled in just 5 years. So this wasn't just a perception issue. It was a documented crisis, proving those old advisory guidelines just weren't cutting it. So responding to all this pressure and this pretty clear evidence of failure, the University Grants Commission, or the UGC, introduced a brand new rulebook in January 2026. It was designed to replace suggestion with mandatory enforceable rules. Finally, a framework with some real teeth.
And this slide really shows the dramatic shift from a persuasive stance to a punitive one. Just take a look at the accountability column. For the very first time, university leaders were going to be held directly and personally liable. And with strict timelines and the power to actually withhold funds, the UGC was finally given some real enforcement power.
This new framework established multiple layers of oversight. It went way beyond just having a single anti-discrimination officer. It mandated a whole new architecture, everything from a central equal opportunity center to mobile equity squads, and even a 24/7 helpline. The goal was to bake equity into the very governance of every single college.
But here's the thing. The very features that gave these rules their power also made them incredibly controversial. Almost immediately, they just sparked this explosion of nationwide protests, political backlash, and a whole series of constitutional challenges in the Supreme Court.
And the entire legal battle, it all hinges on this one specific clause. Regulation 3C, it defines caste-based discrimination as something that targets only members of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes. You know them as SE, ST, and OBC. That very specific definition became the lightning rod for the whole fight.
So opponents, in their petitions to the Supreme Court, argued that this definition was exclusionary and straight-up unconstitutional. They contended that it institutionalizes a form of reverse discrimination by basically assuming that only certain castes can be victims. And to support this, they pointed to incidents of anti-Brahmin graffiti at universities as evidence that, hey, this hostility can go both ways.
Supporters, however, they saw these regulations as a long overdue and constitutionally necessary correction. They argued the point wasn't to deny that others could face hostility. Instead, it was about providing special safeguards for historically oppressed groups that face systemic discrimination, something mandated by the Constitution itself.
So with the protest escalating and legal challenges mounting, the whole issue lands before the Supreme Court, and they stepped in and brought the entire rollout to a very abrupt halt. In a really significant order, the court put the entire new framework on ice. They used their extraordinary powers and said that the regulations raised several critical questions that needed to be addressed. And until then, the country would have to go back to the old Advisory 2012 rules. The Chief Justice's own remarks from the bench really capture the court's deep concern. He openly questioned whether these regulations, which were intended to foster equity, would actually end up dividing society even further. He even warned of a very dangerous impact.
So, you see, the court's intervention wasn't just some procedural pause. It was based on fundamental questions about the regulation's very design. The bench called the language vague and capable of misuse, and they questioned why it didn't address things like regional or even intra-caste harassment. Ultimately, they were afraid the whole approach could have these unintended, sweeping consequences for social cohesion.
The Supreme Court stay leaves India at a really critical juncture. It's now grappling with a fundamental tension that sits right at the very heart of its social justice policies and the future of its campuses.
When you boil it all down, this entire crisis is a clash between two competing ideas of fairness. On one side, you have the principle of targeted protection. This says that to correct historical injustice, the law has to provide special, powerful safeguards for the most vulnerable groups. But on the other side is the principle of universal equality, which argues that institutional protections should be totally caste-neutral and available to any student who faces hostility, no matter what their background is.
And this is the question that now hangs over India. The answer is not only going to determine what the rules look like on college campuses, but it's also going to define the nation's path toward becoming a truly inclusive and equitable society for all its citizens.